So we're going to be discussing diversity of our schools and the differences, even though we grew up very close together, and kind of how this affected, we feel like, the understanding and interest in ag. So starting off, we grew up with it just over the state lines from each other, you in Kansas, me in Missouri. And within us being an hour from each other in the Kansas City area, I grew up in a very rural school, and you grew up in a very suburban.
Yep.
So my average, class size was between 60 and 90 students. Mine was in the 70s, and our school size was had 3 schools in the district, and that was a pre-K, elementary school and high school, and our major demographic was 92% white.
And with mine, I grew up in Olathe, Kansas, and I went to Olathe East, which at one point was one of the biggest high schools in the state. There was, I believe when I left, there was around 2,200 in the school, and I had about 550 in my graduating class, which sounds kind of crazy, but you don't even realize it when you're there, just how many people are there. But specifically, it was a little more diverse than Butler. We had about 66% white people, and I think our biggest demographic was Hispanic at about 20%, and then African American at 15%. And even within my high school, there was still diversity lacking. It just depended where you lived. So there were 2 junior highs that fed into my high school, and one was about 80% white, and the one I went to was about 50% white. And I clearly remember the kids from the other middle school labeling ours as the ghetto middle school. It was like they were labeling us as lesser just because we had a more diverse student body that fed into my high school. So it was interesting even in that, where the real truth is Olathe, Kansas couldn't be any further than front as the ghetto. That's completely not true. It was just crazy how it was, but it was a very big high school. We had horticulture, which was the closest thing to ag. I'm not sure if that ended up to be an ag pathway or not, but we had horticulture, and it kind of linked into, I guess, growing plants, and we grew plants, but I would say mostly there wasn't any interest in agriculture, and it was just a really big deterrent for me, because I come from a farm family. I didn't grow up on the farm, but I had that interest in it, and I really couldn't. There was really nothing for me in that district.
See, that's really different from ours, because having the main population, yes, in our town was Hispanic, and that wasn't a big deal, just because I could tell you in my class itself, my graduating class, I don't think we had one Hispanic student.
Wow.
It was really odd, because I don't even think we had what I would call a actual black family that I could name you, just because we had several students that were mixed race in my class that were our minorities. I could name that were non-white students in my graduating class. I think I could name 6.
Wow.
And one was Native American, we had 2 Marshall Islanders, and then the other percentages would have just been mixed race. And so we had, you were saying, you had the ghetto school, we had the ghetto part of town, but that was just what we called the wannabes because of our proximity to Kansas City.
Yeah.
And we had the what they would define as the black culture of seeing the gangs in Kansas City. It caused a lot of our students to have a really off-putting opinion of our rural town.
Yeah.
They thought they wanted to be like those suburban schools, and honestly, it hurt the outlook of our community. there's a lot of racism, and I know it, and like it wasn't towards the people of our town, because I knew one of the black families in our town, and they were the nicest people ever. But just that stigma that lasts in a rural community is terrible. Like even in agriculture, we didn't have one single person of color or another minority like in our ag program, and you not even truly having a program, like I assume you probably would have had a higher rate of diversity within an ag or FFA program. And I know we try in agriculture, but growing up in that rural community, I didn't see a single minority in agriculture in my hometown whatsoever.
And I think what could make it different where I'm at is that there were just less, I would say there were just really less outdoor options for students to take in like a career and technical class. Like we had at my high school, and in a big district, that was the nice thing about my district, was they had a lot of different college preparedness type CTE things you could do, but none of them involved agricultural. I mean, probably ag would have been the most hands-on. Well, I say that. Besides the technical center, there really aren't there's not much hands-on learning in that district. And I think ag would have just really drawn I honestly think it would have probably drawn more Hispanic. I think it really would have drawn a larger, more diverse group of students. And probably, I honestly think at my high school, they would have gotten more Hispanic kids in agriculture than white suburban students, because a lot of the white suburban students were coming from upper middle class families. And I'm not really sure if this is the case or not, but I just did never see an interest in the type of ag work. I just did never see that in like my classmates that went there. So I think it would have been really interesting if we did have that.
Even though, like, you know, we were a rural community, we honestly didn't have that much interest in ag. Like, so many kids were still already removed from the farm because we had a lot of people coming from the suburban areas that wanted out and just needed more affordable housing, but the Kansas City area is still within a reasonable drive.
Yeah.
And if we want to take a step back from just the, like, you know, diversity of just Hispanic versus white versus what do you think? Like, did you have a larger LGBTQ population there? Like, do you remember even seeing much of that?
Yeah, we had like a club. There was like a club in my high school. So there actually were I don't know if you could put like a percent on it, but there was a club at I doubt they had that at Butler.
There wasn't a club. And like, I could tell, like, you know, as I got older, and like it started becoming like, you know, more of I can't say acceptable, because in my community it still wasn't deemed quite acceptable, but it definitely was more talked about. And I could tell you that, you know, within my class I saw more students that were like, you know, expressing their pride and wanting to talk about it, but it wasn't something that you saw. Like, yes, I have friends now that I've been off of college, and like I've met more people, but it's just something you didn't talk about. Like the derogatory terms were tossed about an awful lot. And it was something that, you know, as we talk about in this class, it's honestly like hard to hear now that we're hearing about it. And I know your school with having a club, that never would have been allowed at my school. The community, like even the kids, we have a lot of kids that would have put a stop to that very fast by saying they wanted to be a part of the club. And they were not accepting of that whatsoever. Yeah. And even in my ag program, like, I can't say my ag teacher was the most accepting person. So I honestly, I remember him making a derogatory joke, and it was at someone within our class, so it was a little odd to hear.
Yeah, and it was still, even with a club at my school, there was a stigma behind it. I mean, like, no offense, but they were a lot of those kids were probably more labeled as, weird or not, it was completely derogatory. But they didn't care. So, but that's what there's still a big difference between that and her school where it just couldn't have even happened. So.
Yeah, I think the aggressiveness that wouldn't have been behind the not allowing that to happen, that had to do with a lot of, I think, why maybe some families didn't come to our area, because we were still labeled, like, we were on the interstate and we had the Walmart. Like, that's a big deal in rural America. We had the Walmart. So we drew in a lot of people from other places. But I can still tell you, like, just the diversity in agriculture is not in our area. Even in you guys not having a lot of programs, like, I can still tell you that from seeing programs around on my side of the state and on yours, the diversity needs to be worked on.
Western Kansas, I think, really, with the influx of the Hispanic population out there, it's a great example to see and hear how diversity really is overwhelming in some ag programs out there, where it's just not even the case in other areas. But it's a really good example, and it really does set the bar high for what we need to be doing in our ag programs to increase and influence diversity in it.
I think National FFA has been doing a pretty good job. We've had several national officers now. That we've even had one from Puerto Rico, and we've talked about the different programs, and they like to do inclusive activities and show, like, honestly, they try to make sure, like, the National FFA did a great job several years ago with integration of women, and now the integration of minorities in agriculture and the implementation of SAE for all and, like, FFA more for all. Like, it's just, they're getting a lot better on establishing a diversity, and, like, the Y Ag initiative of, it's not just, the sows and plows and, your generic white farmer. It is now, like, this is how you're doing it all over the world. And it's just, like, really good to see that coming from a rural community where that was unheard of.
Yeah. And even, this goes a little bit off of diversity, but I'd say a lot of suburban and urban areas, agriculture just isn't even, they just don't even teach that. It's unheard of.
They don't know the front end of a cow from the back end.
No. And that's why I think it would be really cool to start putting more programs in urban and suburban areas, because that's really where they need it in rural areas, but man, they really need it in urban areas too. It's wide scale, and honestly, with the population trends in America, rural areas are sadly getting smaller, and I think it would greatly benefit rural areas if we did put FFA in suburban and urban areas, and influencing more jobs in agriculture to move people back to rural areas, I think, is very important, and it's a benefit from establishing programs in cities, and just trying to draw all kinds of people to agriculture is what we need to be focusing on now. So, and I think overall FFA and the industry in general is heading in the right direction. So,
I think we've done a great job talking about diversity, and I hope Dr. Martinez likes it.
Awesome. Yes.